On May 20th of 1967, an amateur geologist was exploring a small lake in Manitoba when something appeared from the sky. It was a UFO, a cigar-shaped object that was moving in ways that didn't seem possible. Thousands of people have seen UFOs, so what makes this sighting so unique? Simple. This UFO actually landed and sat right in front of the eyewitnesses for half an hour. This stunning event became known as the Falcon Lake Incident, and it is Canada's most famous UFO sighting. What is perhaps most interesting is the fact that the Canadian authorities took this very seriously, and it was investigated by numerous government agencies, including the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Department of National Defense. Even the United States Air Force conducted their own independent investigation into the matter. So what made these top-level government organizations so worried? If they took this UFO sighting so seriously, then there must have been real, legitimate, and believable evidence that it actually happened, right? Let's dive a little deeper into this mysterious episode of UFO history to see if we can uncover the answers.
More than 51 million people entering another
surveillance camera capturing the
unidentified flying object.
lockdowns and mass testing.
Air today that the world is going to end.
Falcon Lake is a small, seemingly insignificant lake in Manitoba, Canada. If you've never heard of Manitoba, you're not alone. There's a running joke among Canadians that Manitoba doesn't even exist. Think of it as the Idaho of Canada. In 1967, a guy named Steve Mihalik was one of the few people visiting Falcon Lake. An industrial mechanic by trade, Steve lived in nearby Winnipeg. His hobby was amateur geology, and he would spend days searching for precious metals. Since Falcon Lake had plenty of quartz veins, he found himself exploring the area quite frequently. In May of 1967, Mihalik set off for Falcon Lake to find gold, silver, or perhaps nickel. What he discovered was something else entirely. Mihalik was in the process of inspecting a quartz vein when his eyes darted towards the sky. A flock of geese had become startled by something, and they were flying away at top speed. Then Steve's eyes wandered towards the source of their agitation, and that's where he saw them. UFOs, 2 of them. They were hovering extremely close by, not more than 150 feet away. Steve later described them as pulsing with a reddish glow. And like many other UFO witnesses, he claimed they resembled cigars, or in his words, cigarette-shaped things with humps in the middle. But Mihalik was a blue-collar worker, a pragmatic, down-to-earth, average Joe. He did not believe in aliens, not even when there were UFOs floating around in front of his 2 eyes. Instead, his immediate assumption was that they were some kind of experimental aircraft, probably from the US military. But Steve was about to get a much closer look at one of the UFOs. To his amazement, one cigar-shaped craft landed on a rocky platform by the edge of the lake. This allowed him to examine the craft in much more detail than perhaps any other UFO witness in history. As he cautiously approached, Steve saw that the UFO was actually more of a disc shape. When flying in the air, after a few tentative steps, he was close enough to touch it. There were no inscriptions or markings on the side, and it was completely smooth without a single seam or rivet. Although the surface appeared metallic, Steve likened it to stained or colored glass. In fact, the object continued to change colors under his gaze, from gray to red and back again. It was hot, and there was a glowing golden corona emanating from all sides. Steve could feel the hot air hitting him in waves, hissing as it left the vehicle. It smelled like sulfur. But despite all these strange features, Steve was still convinced that he was looking at a human-built experimental aircraft. When he got close, he could hear the sounds of a struggling motor inside the craft. He walked around the entire disc, which was about 34 feet in length. Eventually, he discovered a door, and it was open. Steve mustered up his courage and took a peek inside the UFO. Bright lights dazzled him, making it difficult to discern any details. It was at this moment that he began to hear voices. They were faint, barely audible over the hiss of air and whirring motors, but Steve knew they were human. This must have been a relief. Although Steve was relatively certain that it was a military aircraft, there must have been some small part of him that feared he was dealing with aliens. At this point, Steve took a deep breath and raised his voice, announcing his presence and explaining that he was a trained mechanic who could offer them assistance. Immediately, the voices within fell silent. Steve tried again, this time speaking in Russian. No response. He then tried German, but no one answered. He even spoke to them in Polish, but was met again with silence. It seemed that the UFO occupants, whoever they were, weren't too thrilled about being discovered. Steve waited a few more moments for a response before turning to inspect the craft in greater detail. By this point, he was starting to feel a little concerned about being exposed to this strange technology. However, he didn't have much in the way of protection, except a pair of welding gloves he used when chipping away at quartz veins. Donning his goggles, Steve stepped back and was able to see glimpses of the interior through some kind of window. He claims to have seen colorful, flashing lights coming from inside. He decided to back off, and at that moment, the hatch slammed shut as he was taking his first steps away. On an impulse, Steve reached out to touch the craft and his gloves melted. The craft started to regain power, turning counterclockwise until a grid-like panel faced Steve. Suddenly, the panel spat out a blast of superheated gas, hitting him square in the chest and sending him flying through the air. Dazed and confused, Steve realized his clothes were on fire, and he desperately tried to tear off the burning garments as the UFO flew into the distance. Steve was a mess after this incident. He stumbled back into town, vomiting and suffering from extreme nausea. Along the way, he met a Canadian police officer who immediately assumed Steve was drunk and refused to help him. Finally, Steve made it back to his motel room and asked for a doctor, but the local doctor wasn't available, so he went straight home on a Greyhound bus and received treatment in Winnipeg. What the doctors discovered was startling. Steve had suffered severe burns across his chest and stomach, but that's not the crazy part. The burns manifested in a grid-like pattern, the exact shape of the UFO panel that emitted heated gas. The weird thing was that these burns seemed to reappear from time to time, even after they had apparently healed. Immediately, people started to take Steve's story seriously. This was clear evidence that he was telling the truth. But that was only the beginning. As time went on, Steve suffered a range of symptoms, including diarrhea and migraines. He lost a large amount of weight and his white blood cell count dropped to the point where he almost died. It was clear that Steve had been exposed to something, possibly radiation, but tests found no evidence of radiation poisoning. Unfortunately, Steve would never truly recover from these strange medical conditions, and he struggled with them for the rest of his life until his death in 1999. Immediately, people questioned Steve's state of mind. Was he crazy? Did he make everything up? A range of convincing evidence suggests that this was just not the case. First of all, Steve was not the type of person to make up wild tales. He was a simple, down-to-earth blue-collar worker. Psychological tests concluded that he was of sound mind after the incident. Even more convincing is the fact that Steve never wanted attention, and he never claimed that what he saw was extraterrestrial. Until the day that he died, he continuously insisted that the UFO was some kind of military experiment. In fact, Steve regretted ever telling anyone about what he saw because the incident caused an unwelcome amount of stress and attention, eventually leading to issues with his wife. He eventually admitted that if he could go back in time, he would have simply kept silent and continued on with his life. This wasn't some random guy who wanted to make headlines with a fake UFO story. Official investigations from government agencies also found evidence that Steve was telling the truth. The Canadian Department of National Defense teamed up with the Royal Canadian Air Force and the United States Air Force. Returning to the scene of the UFO sighting, helicopters combed the area searching for clues. A 15-foot wide circle of burned vegetation was discovered exactly where the UFO had landed. Testing determined that this area showed high levels of radioactivity. Superheated radioactive metal was found embedded into the rock. Steve's clothes also contained radioactive elements. No one was ever able to explain Steve's injuries, and the entire investigation resulted in an inconclusive result. So what really happened out there? Did Steve actually see a UFO? Skeptics argue that Steve was so drunk that day that he hallucinated the entire thing. Some say that he saw some kind of flying wing military aircraft, such as the Northrop YB-49. One thing is certain, he saw something, and whatever it was, it caused serious injuries. Even if he was completely drunk, that still doesn't explain how he was burned. You have to ask yourself, what could have possibly caused such strange injuries in the middle of nowhere? There was no one else nearby, no machinery or explosives in the rural area. What could have caused radiation poisoning and serious grid-like burns near a small, quiet lake in Manitoba? Something showed up that day. And if it wasn't a UFO, then you have to ask yourself, what else could it have been?